Good morning to most, good afternoon to others, and good evening to the viewing audience across the pond. My name is Jason Miles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. If you are a returning listener or subscriber, so glad to have you back. If you are new to what we do here, welcome. Enjoy what we see. All we ask is that on your way out, you please hit like, possibly subscribe. It's a passive gesture that goes a very long way in making sure we can continue what we do here on TIR. We have a really big show, which is why I want to apologize. That's why we're a little late today. Last time we were late, it was totally my fault. Woke up late. I have no excuse. Today, I actually did wake up on time. But with all these great minds in a virtual green room that don't necessarily get together all the time, it was a great conversation, pre-show conversation that we were having. So I hope you're buckled in, just to say the least. So you got the whole Central Committee tonight. Coming all the way live from Miami, Florida. He is my homie, my dog. He is the man of the Mile Mile Hour. He is the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles.
How are you feeling?
Feeling good.
Did you have pre-workout again like you did last time?
No. Yeah, you said I was a little lively last night.
Somebody timestamped the Edges comment, by the way.
Oh no.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, this is a more serious show, but I mean, you, Jean Bajlan, and Kuba are on this, so regardless of the serious nature, there will probably be a little bit of time for shenanigans, as they say. Speaking of shenanigans, he is live in Missouri, southern Missouri, I believe, with his sidekick and clone. Please welcome Mean Gene Bajlan.
Hello, everybody. How are you doing? Good to see you, Jason. Good to see you, Pascal. I hope you're doing well. I'm here with Baby Zal, who is not so much a baby anymore. Do you want to say hi, Baby Zal?
Wow.
That's Young Man Zal. That's what that is.
Young Man Zal. Okay, Mr. Young Man Zal. Go watch some Batman.
When your jammies are two-piece, you're a young man. When the jammies are one piece, you're Baby Zal. But once you have matured into two-piece jammies, especially the top and the shorts, it's a young man.
He's a young man, yeah, exactly.
Some good Persian coffee.
Speaking of young men, he is our favorite curmudgeon coming from Utah. He's one of my good friends. He's growing his hair out, and I don't know how I feel about it. Please welcome Derek Farn.
Ron. Hey.
Can you headbang now, Farn? Yeah, you can. No. Can you? We got to see the locks flow, Varn. Pascal and I are jealous. Also, coming all the way live from his corporate office in the Death Star, you guys know him as everyone's favorite torturer of Ewoks, Deep State Kuba.
It's not torture, it's just energetic questioning.
I thought you were just going to say compliance.
Kinetic interrogation.
And I want to apologize to our last guest, because when I sent out initially, you know who put this show together? Toussaint pushed this show together. She goes, we should do a 1-year show.
Interrogation.
What'd you say? You broke up. Oh no. Gene. Uh-oh. We lost Gene. Well, in losing Gene, we gained an Electra.
No, but I was here just for Queen's shenanigans and all that. Okay.
There he is. He's got horrible Wi-Fi. That Gene Boslock.
It's
I think it's
Missouri
just-
Wi-Fi.
I think it's just the kids playing games that's killing the Wi-Fi. All the Vigi games. But as we mark 1 year of the genocidal war in Palestine, the world is beginning to recognize the brutal reality of Israel's continued bombardment and occupation of Palestinian territories. Global consciousness is shifting, with more people protesting and challenging the once unquestioned narrative of Israel as a state acting in self-defense. Yet, in the United States, the propaganda machine remains relentless, framing this conflict through a lens that supports maintaining the status quo, a lens shaped by decades of bipartisan support for Israel's aggressive policies. As war continues to be a point of consensus across the political spectrum, what does this mean for Palestinians caught in a violent cycle of occupation, bombings, and systemic oppression? What will this mean in an election year when U.S. political leaders prioritize military alliances over justice? The possibility of this war escalating into a global conflict grows ever more real, and the failure to challenge the dominant narrative only brings us closer to catastrophe. Israel's actions, its illegal settlements, the ongoing siege of Gaza, and the relentless attacks on Palestinian civilians are not simply matters of foreign policy, but integral to U.S. interests in the Middle East. American imperialism and military aid to Israel help sustain the occupation, entrenching the power dynamics that allow such violence to continue. For the Palestinians, this war represents not just a moment of acute suffering, but a continuation of decades of displacement, apartheid, and denial of their right to self-determination. As we reflect on 1 year of this genocidal campaign, we must also confront the moral and political bankruptcy of a global system that allows this to happen with impunity. All right. Kuba, you were with me for far too long the other night. You probably don't want to start the show off. Pascal, what say you? The United States has provided billions in military aid to Israel, effectively underwriting its military operations and occupation. This financial and military support has emboldened Israel's expansionist policies, making the U.S. complicit in the atrocities committed against Palestinians. From a left perspective, we must challenge this narrative, recognizing that U.S. foreign policy in the region is not about democracy or peace, but about maintaining hegemony and control over a strategic region through an imperialist alliance with Israel. How do we, on the left, challenge that? Or can we even challenge that?
Well, I think that one thing that's become obvious for me is that what is going on in the Middle East, particularly with Gaza and the Palestinians, is going to have a tangible effect on what's happening with the election. Because the Green Party has decided to make its vice presidential candidate Muslim intellectual Butch Ware, who has a pretty strong recognition in the Muslim American space, there's a strong possibility that large numbers of active Muslims or religious Muslims in places like Michigan, places like Florida, Chicago, and Illinois are going to support the Green Party. Those votes can make a difference between Kamala Harris winning those electoral spaces and losing. So I'm not making predictions, but what I'm saying is that I think that the Democrats, assuming that they can just neglect the concern of large numbers of Palestinians and Muslims in this election over this subject matter, is going to be have some definitely negative consequences. And I think that the way the Green Party has played this may end up costing this a couple of key states to the Democratic Party in this election as well.
Electra, what say
Yeah,
you?
I was about to say, if I may, I fully agree with you. And I would like to highlight that it's not only Muslims, Arabs, Palestinians, there are also many outraged Americans who do not culturally, identify with any of these groups. They just want to take a stance against genocide. And quite frankly, it's not only their inability, their straightforward stupidity, if you ask me, to appreciate how internal dynamics are changing. It's also the arrogance that they so unapologetically demonstrate towards their own voters, right? They're really making a very conscious effort to become the new serious Republican Party, right? Trump has taken over the Republican Party. It's a different creature. It's a populist, far right, whatever you want to call it, but it is not the Bush Republican Party anymore. So we see the Cheney's migrating in a very straightforward way.
Yeah.
With their supporters and everybody else to the Democratic Party. And Kamala Harris, our hope for change, I'm being sarcastic here, is campaigning as we speak with Liz Cheney herself. So they're making a very deliberate choice to tell their own voting base that they can go screw themselves, quite frankly, because what 95% or I think the number is like 90 or 95% of Democrats seem to want regarding the war, the Middle East, or in general, doesn't matter at all. The uncommitted, that's how we met, right? We're representing this final effort to save the Democratic Party from itself. We're not even given the opportunity to speak at the convention. All kinds of corporate Republicans were celebrated as heroes that are going to bring the real America to the party, right? And unapologetically so, we have Kamala Harris herself campaigning with Liz Cheney, who is telling good Republicans that this should be their choice as a Republican, that the Democratic Party represents the Republican values, whereas Donald Trump is a populist thug. And we can all agree that Donald Trump is a populist thug. But the question that emerges here is that what are our choices, right? So we have these migration of Republicans, like serious deep state warmongering Republicans to the Democratic Party, thereby unsurprisingly so. Not only they don't want to stop the war, they profiteer from it. This is everything they stand for. And like the wild card of Donald Trump, possible Donald Trump presidency, which nobody knows what's going to happen. So I fully agree with what you said. I think it's a manifestation of arrogance, profound stupidity, and they will pay a price for it because many of their voters, including myself, traditional voting groups, are just outraged. And it's not only because of the genocide, it's just one too many for many, many traditional voting blocs at this point. My 2 cents.
Jason, are you calling on me to answer some questions right
Yeah,
now?
I'm putting you in the if this is Hollywood Squares, then the camera's on you.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So
well, obviously this conflict is going to have an effect on the American election in some way or another, whether directly, as Pascal and Electra pointed out, turning off certain voting blocs, but also indirectly in terms of how it is driving a broader realignment in amongst the American political elite. I think the observation that you're seeing a lot of these Republicans from the Bush era migrating across to the Democratic Party, I don't think that is particularly a new development. We've been seeing that since 2016. Basically, you have the liquidation of the Trump, wing of the party, took over the party and ousted the kind of professional cadre of the Republican Party, the consultant class, the establishment, deep state people, and a lot of those people have found a home in the Democratic Party, and that's going to have implications. But in terms of the conflict, if we look regionally, this conflict is there is no kind of end point for this conflict for the Israelis, in the sense that they've launched this war in Gaza, and now they're opening up a second front in Lebanon. They've been behaving provocatively for the last year. And, what I mean by this specifically is, you have, for example, the violation of diplomatic norms. I don't have any particular love for the Iranian government or for the Syrian government, but when you bomb a consul in Syria, that is a kind of violation of the kind of fundamental basis of international law, and so you've had this like ongoing destabilization. Now, my conspiracy theory, as it were, is that what we're seeing probably at the moment behind the scenes is a repeat of what happened in 1968. I think that probably the Israeli government is in communications with the Trump campaign. I mean, it obviously is in communications, but I think, the Trump campaign is perhaps saying, like, don't end this conflict until we're elected, right? And I think that one of the reasons let's put it this way. Even if you say, look, after November the 7th, Israel was going to cross into Gaza, that's was going to happen. And I can understand that perspective. You have an attack, what do you expect a state to do? A state will respond in a particular way. But, there have been numerous off-ramps, especially in November last year when there was the opportunity for a peace, some kind of a negotiated peace and ceasefire. The Israelis didn't go for it. And instead, we've been seeing this war being sustained. Now, I think in the short term, this is perhaps, and again, this is my conspiracy theory about it. I think that the Israelis are hoping to undermine the Democratic Party and have them lose an election and have a Trump administration that is going to be more favorable to the kind of outcomes that they're looking for. And then I think in a broader perspective, I think what people have to understand what I understand by the Israeli policy is that the truth is the Israelis don't believe in that peace is possible, and they don't even believe that peace is a kind of good thing to have anyway. I think the Israeli policy at the moment is based on a kind of escalating violence, based on this doctrine of mowing the lawn, that they will impose enormous cost of violence on Palestinians and neighboring Arab countries that will buy them X amount of time of peace until the next crisis blows up, in which case I think they believe, well, then we will just exercise another wing of violence. In the short and medium term, I think this is actually a sustainable policy for the Israelis. The reason I say it's sustainable is because for example, if you compare it to South Africa, the demographic balance in Israel-Palestine is not so overwhelmingly in favor of one side. White people, I think, made 10%, 12% of the South African population. And they were also, the white population was fundamentally economically dependent on black labor. The entire apartheid system was, in part driven by a desire to hyper exploit black labor in South Africa. In Israel, there's a kind of different dynamic. They want the land without the Palestinians, and the demographic balance is, they have enough people to kind of maintain that occupation in the short and medium term. Secondly, at least in the short and medium term, they have the undying support of the Western powers. So I think for the Israelis, this is what they see as being a sustainable policy, that there will be these periodic flare-ups. They will use an enormous amount of violence to silence them down and buy themselves a sort of period of peace. I think that's the doctrine that's going forward. Whether that's sustainable in the long term, and we were talking before the show with Electra about this, and I think she'll disagree with me on this. I don't know if that's sustainable in the long term, but I think what the long term says is there will be two ends to this. Either you will have to have some kind of democratization on that territory between the river and the sea. There'll have to be either democratization or the annihilation of enough of the Palestinian population to ensure that they are never, ever a demographic threat, quote unquote, to Jewish supremacy in that region. So I think, there are two paths where this can go. One is a genocidal path, and one is one where, you'll have democratization. But I don't think there's a kind of middle road, because I think the fact that settlement in the West Bank has advanced so far, and there's so much interpenetration of those populations, and that the settler population is so influential in Israeli politics. I think the two-state solution has effectively been foreclosed. I mean, I know people would say, well, the two-state solution is not ideal. Yeah, of course, but if it could be reached and it could calm the situation down, that would be fantastic. But I think that has been foreclosed by realities on the ground, and the fact that the Israelis don't, openly say that they don't support the two-state solution anymore. Because ultimately, what I see with a lot of these mainstream media justifications for Israeli policy now, it's remarkably a pessimistic discourse. There was the interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates the other day on CBS morning show, where the questioner was criticizing Ta-Nehisi Coates for his comparison of Israel to Jim Crow, America, and apartheid. But ultimately, his argument came down to, yes, but have you considered that the Palestinians deserve to live under occupation and apartheid? So that is kind of my perspective on this. Short to medium term, it looks pretty grim. Long term, who even knows? But I would be wary of predicting the future.
Brother Varn?
Oh, there's a lot to talk about here. I was thinking about the situation in 2006 with Lebanon and the U.S. actions there versus now. In 2006, in the Lebanon War, Bolton held out the blocking of a call for a ceasefire for a month. Then he blamed the Israelis' failure to remove Hezbollah threats for eventually supporting the ceasefire. Now, of course, he had to put it in bellicose neoconservative framework. That's Bolton's deal. He's probably one of the worst one of them. But when we look at what they actually did, the current Biden-Harris administration is actually maintaining something to the right on foreign policy of the Bush administration. And the question is why? Because that's something that I think we have to deal with the electoral dynamics of the United States a little bit more than the Democrats might lose, because, yeah, they might. It's a toss-up. The treatment of the Palestinians, plus some smart moving by the Greens, may cost them some key areas. It won't get the Greens even 5% of the U.S. vote. I'm willing to stake money on that, but it could, be a spoiler. And before people think that this means that I'm endorsing the Democrats, they deserve to be spoiled. My thinking about this, though, about why it doesn't seem to matter, is that the other alternative is actually closer to the Netanyahu government than even the Biden-Harris administration is. So that dynamic is something. When we say we don't know what Trump's going to do, we have a good idea what he's going to do on Gaza. We don't know what he's going to do on other geopolitical issues, and the invoking of the Iranians actually produces a double bind for the Trump administration. On one hand, Trump wants to ease ties with Russia, which Iranians are a longstanding ally. On the other hand, Trump seems to really have it out for the Iranians. So there's a lot of geopolitical betting on all sides about how different demographics are captured. There is nowhere for them to go. Now, I have no idea how long. We talk about the situation in the Levant, and there's other mitigating factors we have to look at. Mohammed bin Salman, which desperately wants to normalize relationships with Israel, has finally backed off and is actually making something that I would have never predicted in my life, some concessionary olive branches to Iran, which that is a really big game changer in a lot of ways, as well as saying that that even though he wants to normalize relations with Israel, he cannot do so until there is a recognized Palestinian state. So there's a lot of different dynamics going on in the region. I mean, we've seen Israel expand into Syria and do what, like, feel like half the countries in the region are doing, which is use Syria as a bomb pincushion. If we can go over the number of bombings that have happened in Syria since 2013, it's actually kind of astronomical. So there's a lot to see about the destabilization of the region. One thing we're going to need to watch for, how long are U.S. bases in Iraq going to be safe? Like when are we going to see more active attacks on the bases in the area? That might push opinion in a different way. There's a lot of volatility here, but I will say, like, one thing that I've thought about a lot when we talk about the U.S. response to it, I've gone through my trilemma of the Biden administration's talk about de-escalating. They're either lying, which a political article last week indicates they are. They're lying about it, or they're lying about it because they're afraid that they actually couldn't do it anyway. Like that, even though there's no way in the long run for the U.S. For the Israel to survive this without U.S. support, in the short run, Netanyahu may be playing games in a way that he would ignore the U.S. imperative, even if they did slow down munitions shipments. I don't know that. That actually seems like a wild card, but it has actually occurred to me that might be part of what they're at least afraid of. Or they're incredibly incompetent. But I'll be honest with you, their continuances of shipping the amount of munitions they are to Israel means that the incompetence would have to be pretty delusional for that to be the answer. So we can pretty much scratch that one off. We put the second answer as more likely, so it leaves us with the first one, that they're most likely lying. And I think it's pretty obvious to everyone else. The question is, however, is any other major power willing to put real stakes in the game? Not symbolic, not rhetorical, actual stakes. The expansion of things with Iran does actually make that seemingly possible. But so far, I have been surprised at how little some of the non-Western powers they've even done and doing anything more than symbolic pushbacks. There's probably reasons for that have to do with technological and weapons systems integration between Israel and some of these other great powers. But I can't imagine that they're actually that important to risk delegitimacy, which in all cases, there is a threat of delegitimization. Even in the U.S., I mean, this is one of the few times we've seen I can't think of a time where both on the center right and the center left, not just the far left, I've seen pretty deep sympathies towards Palestinians in America. Now, are they deep enough for anyone to vote on it outside of those particular areas that we're talking about earlier in Michigan and Dearborn and whatnot? I don't know, and that seems to be the Democratic Party's gambit here. But it does seem like it's an ever-evolving situation that's very shitty. We haven't mentioned the elephant in the room. We're all waiting on bated breath on what Bibi Netanyahu's or whatever government they have, it's not the work cabinet anymore, is going to do in response to the Iranian infrastructure missiles, which we know that the Iranians, at the time, I mean, people were like, oh, it's like the bombing of Dresden. I was like, oh, that's stupid. And then I looked at it and I'm like, oh, they didn't kill a single person. Like, they strategically targeted very specific areas. The Iron Dome, supposedly, they were claiming at first it took out like 50% of the missiles. It looks like they took out about 10. The Iron Dome is not designed to deal with like proper rockets. It's more like whatever rockets you can cobble up in a kitchen sink in areas that are war-torn already. So what the response to that will be, That's going to be a big deal. And I actually don't know the US's calculus on that. I can't entirely figure it out. So, yeah. But I don't know. I mean, I normally play the role of Dr. Doom in all these talks, although Kuba's doomier than me, so he comes on next. But I feel like right now there's so many moving parts when I try to draw the lines on the chalkboard and look like a crazy person that I come to just a big fucking clusterfuck, and I don't really know what's going to happen next.
Speaking of clusterfucks, it's what Cuba likes to install in foreign governments before the coup.
Doesn't count as a clusterfuck unless there's at least one Wookiee.
What say you about all this, Cuba? We had a great conversation Wednesday night about kind of the perils of a Trump presidency and how it would look very different from his 2016 reign. So what say you about this current state of affairs in the Middle East with what we're seeing with the Biden-Harris administration opposed to what we might see with a Trump administration?
Well, one thing that I would flag is that this isn't the only war that might influence the election. The conflict in the Ukraine is ongoing, yes, and there's a substantial Polish population in Pennsylvania that would, I think, under typical circumstances, be happy to give Trump more serious look as a candidate. But when it comes to Russian aggression in the Polish near abroad, depending on how far removed they are from the initial migration from Poland, depending on how thickly they maintain a connection to the old country, they might feel the need to vote for the Democrats because Trump would be an unreliable partner for the war against Russia and Eastern Europe. It's also worth considering what like you said, the difference between a Trump and the Kamala Harris administration. It's hard to know how much more support Israel could get from the United States. The Kamala Biden policy towards the war in Gaza, arms shipments to Israel, there isn't that much room for it to be friendlier. Despite rhetoric about pushing for a ceasefire, despite attempts to try to make the United States seem like a champion for Palestinian human rights, I can't get past the fact that the pier that was built supposedly to deliver humanitarian assistance to Palestinians was then used as a staging ground for Israeli strikes into Gaza. That basically tells you all you need to know about the Biden-Harris orientation. So what would Netanyahu get from Trump that he wouldn't from a Democratic presidency? And the only difference that I see is the profound animus that Trump has, even deeper than the Democrats, towards Iran, together with his identification with the Abraham Accords and trying to strike a deal between the Gulf Arabs and Israel. It could be the revival of that type of Sunni Israeli détente is what Netanyahu is going for. Right now, there is the risk that despite every effort to the contrary, despite his entire policy being oriented around boxing in Iranian influence and limiting the reach and solidarity of Shia groups throughout the Middle East, that Mohammed bin Salman is having to find some kind of accord with Iran, which increases the leverage of countries like China that can play that broker role that the United States is no longer able to.
Electra, you had something you wanted to add?
I have many things I would like to add
Oh.
because there are many very interesting points raised here, and I don't know how to unpack them all. But let me start with like the regional dynamic. I feel like we have a little bit of a top-down approach to everything. And as if I may share something slightly irrelevant, superficially so, I'm a historian of the 19th century, right? And I focus on, I'm trying to explain revolutions and nationalism in the 19th century and early 20th century. Aside from like the socioeconomic and military dynamic and all that, how come that the Greek Revolution was successful, or that the United States, the European alliance at the time decided to support it in the 1820s and 1830s. And I feel that it's a little illogical, unfair, and conceptually problematic on our end to completely disregard public opinion in the regions that are directly affected by this mayhem. And we're not only talking about the genocide in Gaza, we're talking about the symbolism of it all, and also Israel's overt position that they deserve to expand over Lebanon, Syria, perhaps, and the type of far-right nationalistic, expansive arrogance that does not seem to be all that strategic to me anymore, Jean. And I have been following very few Israeli analysts who still oppose the war. And I think they make a very good point, right? Israel does not seem to have a strategy. It is overwhelmed by emotion. And this is a recipe for disaster, according to me, for Israel as well in the long term. But as far as the broader region and the international community is concerned, we have to take into account what has happened in the past 9 months. Israel went from being, the all celebrated only democracy in the Middle East, right? This is how it was presented to the people, and most people don't have a clear idea as to what's happening over there. And by people, I mean in the US or Western Europe, etc. So in the past 9 months, like international opinion has turned completely everywhere in the world, included but not limited to the United States of America, right? The last pillar of Israel's standing. Within the Jewish American community, we really have to start paying attention how American Jews feel about all this, especially among the youth, and the unprecedented, really, gigantic changes that are happening. Most important, in the region, I don't think that these very sinister calculations, like the chess game type of approach, apply when 95% of the Arab world, the Islamic world, and everything in between are positioning themselves against the genocide and against Israel at this point. Even an autocracy like Saudi Arabia have to take this into account. And this is why we see unprecedented developments, such as what's happening in Qatar, right? With Iran having this meeting in Qatar and then going to Lebanon during the bombings, and they're celebrated for their resilience and defiance. And all of a sudden we have objectively autocratic religious theocracies, bad actors by all understandings of human rights and international law, demonstrating a much better understanding of how international law works and how important public opinion matters. The ones that seem to be completely ignorant and lost in their own arrogance, I'm going to use the exact same term again, are US administrators and bureaucrats, or whoever is making decisions on behalf of our government right now. And back to the point of like Ukraine, of course, like what's happening in the Middle East is not the only issue regarding tumultuous international developments, but Ukraine and the Middle East are directly connected via Russia, right? So Russia and Iran are in this together, not in full harmony, clearly, but they depend on each other to a certain extent, both for Ukraine and for stopping Israel from completely annihilating everything. And I'm not saying they have the exact same stance, but their military and geostrategic interests are connected. So all of these calculations, first of all, do not take into account public opinion at all. And I think we should, because again, as a historian of the 19th century, I feel like we're talking about the Holy Alliance and the decisions that empires were making at the time. At the end of the day, even empires back in the day could not stop the devastating to them spread of nationalist ideals, and had to adjust their rhetoric in order to survive and defend their own interests. This is like a very pragmatic calculation to think about the people, right? Even if you don't really give a shit about them, you have to take them into account within an empire. And we claim to be democracies. So the international opinion and internal dynamics here in the US, I think, are extremely important from a pragmatic perspective, not due to empty emotion or idealism or anything along these lines. So the fact that regional actors back in the Middle East right now, we have Qatar, right, approaching Iran. And I feel that it's Qatar, not China yet, that is trying to emerge as this, rational actor that is going to step in and take over, given the indisputable American failures of American diplomacy, in lack of a better word. So we see Qatar approaching Iran, and Saudi Arabia, they're not there yet, clearly, but they're saying that they agree with Iran on Gaza, right? That was a statement that was released yesterday. So if we have Saudi Arabia and Iran publicly via Qatar joining forces to a limited extent, but still, and saying that Gaza is a red line for our people, and we have to take that into account, I think it'd be very myopic for us to completely dismiss these developments. Thank you.
Derek Varn, you want to talk a little bit about Jewish politics domestically?
Yeah, domestically, and I'll talk about the region a little bit. So domestic Jewish politics are really, really interesting in that the institutions of Jewish life are largely controlled by baby boomers who are almost universally Zionist. Something that Norman Finkelstein said, which was interpreted by some people to be borderline anti-Semitic, that I don't love the way he said it, but I think he's actually correct, that institutions power dynamics in the Jewish community actually do not reflect popular Jewish opinion. And you see this actually a lot in like leaders of a lot of these protests at elite universities a few months back. A lot of them were Jewish. When you think about what that means to American Jewish culture, and if you're not a Heb, I don't know if you like quite get it, but Reform Judaism in America in particular has basically been its religion has been pretty much Zionism for a while. That does not mean there aren't plenty of liberal Jews in those communities. It does not mean that the that what Israel does is popular even amongst some liberal Zionists, which exist in America, although there are fewer and fewer of them, and doesn't exist in Israel anymore. And I want to talk a little bit about that too, because there's a lot of misunderstandings of the way people talk about what's going on and what ethnic groups are doing what in Israel itself. There is a belief that most of this is about Ashkenazi settlerism. And yes, that is a fundamental definition of part of what's going on in Zionism. But a lot of Bibi Netanyahu's actual most militant support are not the 20% of Israelis that have a dual passport and can leave to Europe or the United States. They are predominantly Russian or Mizrahi. And the reasons for that are complicated, but there's two. One, liberal Israelis have been largely quit being Israelis in the last decade. I don't think people have really been paying attention to the amount of self-immigration that has been happening from Israel from more liberal Israelis. There's been a lot of people returning to the U.S. and to Germany. In fact, I remember reading articles even before any of this happened about people returning to Germany due to the right-wing nature of Israeli politics. Two, the Mizrahi community, given that so much of it comes from Yemen, Iraq, and Egypt and other places that where Jewish communities were well integrated with Muslim communities for hundreds of years, and then the Balfour Agreement totally fucked that up. A lot of them see this as existential. And that's where some of their irrationality seems to be coming from. And I do think that has to be dealt with more than most of the people I hear talking about the situation internally want to deal with, because what it does mean is there's not going to be a large amount of people who just desettlerize themselves and go somewhere else, because it is zero sum in this case. At least in the minds of a lot of the right-wing Israeli support. But what we've seen is basically the Israeli left is dead in a true sense. I mean, like they've either gone, there's fewer and fewer of them. Other people who were more sympathetic to labor and labor's policies towards the Palestinians historically aren't a whole lot better. It's a truly ugly scenario there. In the larger region, I do think when we get into the tensions about public opinion, I've been thinking a lot about public opinion in these empires in the 19th century, and I do wonder, in a very real way, and maybe I'll turn this over to someone like Kuba to speak to, because he's more of the military guy than I am, but how much the difference in the perceived technical superiority of these militaries affects people's willingness to bend to popular opinion, particularly after the stalling of the Arab Spring. I really do wonder about that, because in the 19th century, a protest proved that you could field an army with musketeers, and the government had slightly better arms, but not a lot. You know, they had giant cannons, they had tanks, maybe towards the end of that, but you're still dealing with, like, at the beginning of the 19th century, dealing with cavalry versus infantry. And cavalry has an advantage, but if you got enough infantry, that advantage goes away. When you start dealing with cluster bombs, things are harder to parse out. Now, however, that can lead people to underestimate, popular supported militia forces. The great example of that is the Houthis. And Hezbollah in the prior 2 decades. So I don't want to underestimate that. I probably don't take as hard of a line as some other people here, but I don't think we know how this goes, and I do wonder if the leaders in these countries know how this goes either. And so to me, that's a lot more of an open question. And the last thing I want to deal with is we do have to deal with the tensions between different Arab states, like the tensions between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and Egypt and Qatar. When I was the tensions between Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Like, they are unified on this question, but they're not unified with each other. So their responses to how to solve this question, are probably very, very different. But here, I think popular opinion probably does matter, because a lot of these states, both the Iranian and, to a lesser degree, the Saudi Arabian, do want, even if they may not totally need, popular legitimization. And given, for example, in Iran, I mean, with the general population, what Iran does in regards to Palestine is actually probably one of the most popular things they do in regards to the way most Iranians, be they ethnic Persians or not, feel. And that's something that I think does matter for the internal legitimacy of the Islamic Republic, when economically they're kind of perpetually in a bad spot thanks to Western sanctions. I'll turn it over. I just wanted to get all those different like contending
something to
things
get
out.
off your chest. Just to kind of move the conversation along a little bit. Despite growing global protests against Israel's actions, mainstream American media continues to push pro-Israel narratives, portraying Palestinian resistance as terrorism while ignoring the daily violence and oppression inflicted on Palestinians. How can we break through this propaganda to build a movement that holds Israel accountable for its war crimes and pressures the U.S. to end its unconditional support? I'll start with you, Brother Robert.
Yeah, I'd like to address this, particularly connected to Elitra's comment about the mass population, and we've been talking on our show a couple of times with scholars talking about what is the actual effect in this current age of movement politics on the capacity to change foreign policy or financial institutions. And our good friend of the show, who wrote a paper, Derek, what's the brother's name? Jason?
Which one?
Who on movement politics, the lack of capacity of movement politics to
white guy, black guy. White guy?
Yeah. Derek Besner.
Okay. Yeah,
Besner,
Danny.
Danny Besner. Besner's theory is that the capacity of movement politics to change things on the global level in terms of foreign policy or financial services policy or financial policy for the West is over pretty much, and is not coming back. And what he means by movement politics, he's talking about the capacity of large scale movements like we had in the 60s to come back again. But I had a problem believing that. But I also realized that the ideological superstructure of American media and capitalist ideological formation mechanisms, academia, higher education, banking, finance, where the professional managerial class is based, all of those institutions are premised on protecting the Zionist narrative. And as much as they may be willing to clash like people like students or activists, I really wonder the capacity of activists and students to overcome the overall ideological capacity of Zionist individual institutions to manipulate the zeitgeist amongst the people. So I'd like to answer to that. Like, how is this going to be done exactly? And I'd like to Kuba to actually follow up as well.
No, thank you. I mean, all these are valid points. Let me just clarify that I wasn't talking only about public opinion in the so-called West, right, in the US and Western Northern Europe. I was also talking about public opinion in the Middle East, like among the different regions. That my argument was that even a religious autocracy such as Saudi Arabia needs to take into account the fact that 99% of their people consider the people they claim to represent, Muslims, Arabs, right? See the issue of Gaza at this point as non negotiable, right? So it is about time for us to start appreciating that other regions matter as well. Yes, America is the global superpower. There is no doubt about our influence and how responsible and complicit we are about all this. But I was talking about the international public opinion and more specifically what's happening right in the broader region, and that is what's motivating um, local actors to start revisiting, not in a sincere way and not fully perhaps, but we do see some really tangible changes. That's what's inspiring them, right? Saudi Arabia, the leadership clearly does not care at all about Gaza, but 99% of Muslims, Arabs, do care about it terribly. So they do have to take that into account. As for movements in the so-called good old West, um, that's a very complex question. I think they can transform into something different. And we do live in the 21st century. It is the age of social media. And what we do is not limited to the classroom. Poll after poll suggests that the public opinion in the US, despite the propaganda, despite the gaslighting, the constant gaslighting promoted by all mainstream media platforms, public opinion in the US is changing, because we all know somebody who is on Facebook or Twitter, on like Instagram or whatever people are using these days, posting constantly about it, because students and the youth are organizing outside of the classroom. I would argue that academia has been very, very slow to respond, if anything, to all this, right? With the exception of people who have actual expertise in these issues and are clearly overwhelmed because, among other things, it's their families that are getting slaughtered in 3 different countries. It's the academic response, because academia is part of systemic America, right? It's part of the system, it's part of the regime, has been relatively slow. Aside from platitudes about human rights and all that, we are not having any substantial discussions. And the encampments were driven by students with the participation and support of a youth movement that is definitely not controlled by or inspired by anything we do as academics. So I don't think the moment of social movements is over for the so-called West. I think it's about time for us to take a step back, right, and participate on what's now emerging as an international public opinion in collaboration with everybody else. And I'm learning from my students that this is exactly what they're doing, because they're getting their information not from me, but from their relatives, their people, the youth in these regions and across the world, right? And then we're having a discussion about this. So it's a transformative moment for sure. I don't know if that's answering your question, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that we are becoming globalized from below more than ever before. And if movements have to have a future in the US as well, the dynamic needs to change. It won't be the US leading the world in revolution anymore. It will be the world teaching the US why other people matter, even from a pragmatic perspective. And I want to revisit my argument about the public opinion before. And Jean and I were having a conversation right before the podcast about your student who discovered he had autistic characteristics, spectrum-like characteristics, or he was on the spectrum at the age of 30. I discovered that much later, but I do have the same mental or intellectual profile. What I'm trying to say is that I'm a very rational thinker. And rationally speaking, any calculation that is not taking into account that what 90% of the population feels is important is an irrational calculation. Even if you want to govern people as an empire, you really need to convince them that this is a deal that makes sense to them, get along pretending to be a democracy in any way, right? So, from a pragmatic, very rational, and calculated perspective, not taking into account how people feel about any given issue is ridiculous. And back to the issue of military history, and like we're moving back and forth in the 19th century. Look, if you study who became a nation state and who didn't after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, for instance, which is what I specialize in, it had absolutely nothing to do with their military capacity. The Greeks had zero military capacity compared to everybody else, and yet it was their national revolution that led to the establishment of independent state, right, in the 1830s, because Europe, for all kinds of reasons, decided to offer support, and that had much to do with public opinion. So, whom did they decide to support according to their own introvert, cultural racism, etc.? Is an entirely different discussion and an interesting one to have. But whom their people wanted to support was important to these dynasties, and this is what, at the end of the day, decided which nation states would be sanctioned by the then international community and which weren't. Fast forward to the 21st century, we have to appreciate that Palestine has already won this war. The international opinion is accepting that. Palestine is a symbol. They have won the war of messages, they have won the war of symbolism. Many communities connect their struggle, their colonization, their resistance against colonization, internal semi-colonization, external colonization, whatever you want to call it, segregation, discrimination against, to the Palestinian issue. So winning the war of information in the 21st century is half the battle. And disregarding that is, quite frankly, not a very rational choice, I would argue. I hope that answers somewhat the question.
Kuba, did you want to?
Yes, I think that we don't need to be theoretical about this. We have the data. People have done the empirical research, and I was looking it up right now. The study, I think, is Gillen's page, and it demonstrated that when it comes to congressional voting preferences, the expressed interests of a representative's electors, right, their district, the people who voted for them, has absolutely no role in determining their vote on policies put to Congress. The thing that does influence voting patterns is the preferences of donors and of interest groups, but of the general public, it's not even noise. And similarly, when it comes to public opinion within the Middle East, you say that Saudis agreeing 99% that Gaza is unacceptable to them. That's not news. The Saudi population, the population of Muslim majority countries throughout the Middle East, has always been heavily, heavily anti-Zionist, heavily, heavily anti-Israeli, very, very much in solidarity with the Palestinian people. This is not a change. This is not a development. The reason that Saudi Arabia took the meeting with Iran is because it absolutely had to. And that is the minimum they had to do. They've done it. They're not going to do any more. There's also some other problems with looking to public opinion in the Middle East as being some kind of prompt towards progressive resolution of the current conflict in Palestine, which is traditionally when there has been a great ferment in countries like Saudi Arabia for resistance against especially non-Muslim powers in the region. Well, that outlet, the outlet for that sentiment, has been support for groups like the Taliban, Al Qaeda, ISIS, as much as it has been participation in mass politics. And one serious complication to any kind of unified pressure on Israel from the neighboring Arab Muslim countries is the fact that they're divided over questions like the extent to which they tolerate the support, tolerate the Muslim Brotherhood as an international political movement, the sides that they take in conflicts such as in Syria, in Lebanon, in Libya, in Yemen. So there's, in some ways, the invasion of Gaza and Lebanon is another front in the struggle between Sunni powers and the Iranian-backed so-called axis of resistance, right? The Houthis that are successfully blocking access to the Suez Canal by powers hostile to Palestine, Hamas, they are very closely aligned with Iran, and in the very same area, right? In Qatar, Iran and Saudi Arabia talk. In Yemen, their proxies kill each other. So the situation is quite complicated, and I think that governments across the world have all kinds of tried and true techniques that are designed to diffuse and mitigate the influence of public opinion on their policies. And when it comes to winning the symbolic war, well, I would put the Palestinian trophy next to the Dalai Lama's, next to Rojava's Resistance Award, right? You may have the sympathy of the world, you may be a symbol for resistance to repression. Think about the movement against the junta in Myanmar. You may absolutely have the moral high ground recognized to everybody, recognized by everybody, but that by itself can just lead to a very sympathetic post-mortem rather than to any tangible improvement in your fate.
Jean Bajlan, in the dark.
Well, I think Electra wanted to respond, so I will yield my time to her and go after her.
I shall yield my time to Electra.
You're such a gentleman. Yeah, I have a lot to say. First of all, I was trying to participate in the chat because I'm reading the comments here, and like,
Oh, don't
look,
do that.
Joel,
Don't
if you
do
know,
that. Don't
okay.
look into the abyss, Electra. You look
Oh,
into
no,
the
not
abyss.
looking into the abyss. If you want to have like a conversation, people, about Ottoman history, given that that's what I do professionally, let's have it, right? Because we cannot just throw around, our opinion based on what we have learned in high school or even taking a master class about, the Ottoman Empire and have a discussion. I mean, I know what you're arguing there on the chat is like factually not how we approach Ottoman history these days, at least on an academic campus. So it is a much more complex situation. And you're arguing, for example, they say does not make sense. How so? Can you explain why the independent nation state was created in the 1830s? Why the Arabs were denied any self-determination, if not by reference to how public opinion in Europe and the US felt towards Greek nationalism and later on nationalism in Southeast Europe, etc., right? So the war of information is extremely important. And if you actually study Ottoman history, I mean, the Greeks stood zero chances against the Ottoman army, declined or not. They were completely slaughtered. They were destroyed. Actually, it was the fact that they were slaughtered by the Ottomans that won them independence, because it caused such outcry in Europe that it couldn't be contained anymore. Although almost all empires at the time would absolutely like to do so. Not because they liked the Ottomans, but because the Ottomans were part of the status quo, right? So we cannot just throw arguments around without having a conversation based on the facts. But this is slightly irrelevant. You have to accept that what I'm saying is based on my expertise, which is precisely what I said. Now, regarding the facts, yes, the argument that the government or any administration does not care at all about the people is, of course, right. I fully agree on that. I'm not. Let me clarify. It's my fault, perhaps, that I wasn't very clear about what I was saying. I don't argue that the Democrats care at all, or anybody else, about us versus the donors or whomever is controlling them. I fully agree with your cynicism there. What I was trying to argue is that in the long term, this is a stupid calculation that will cause them the election. And when it will start causing them elections and very real losses in power, then they will start taking that into account as well. So on our end, if we are to talk about how are we, the people, right, going to go about this is precisely the message that we should start giving them at some point. Not because they care, not because they take into consideration what the people say. They start taking into consideration what the people say only when they start losing elections, right? It's 100% a pragmatic calculation based on selfish interests. But because they're stupid enough to completely ignore that short term, this usually materializes long term. Is what I was trying to say. And I see many interesting comments there on the chat that I was trying to respond to. But we cannot have a serious conversation about the 19th century unless we all have access to the same sources and we know what it is that we are referring to. Okay, so for now, you have to take that as an argument that is supported by academic research, that ideology and the war of information had much to do with the success of national movements in the 19th century and beyond. And fast forward to the 21st century, I think, given how much more central global communications and international communications and social media and all that have become in informing public opinion, not taking that into account is an omission. And Jim, thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Hi.
Hi.
Uh-oh.
Ellie?
Whoa, he's got his you got your clothes on. You're ready to go cause some trouble.
He wanted to come and say hi to Jason Miles.
Hi, living Zal. Where are you going today, Zal? What is on your agenda for today?
I do like my shirt. It's a Halloween shirt.
I do like. Does your shirt glow in the dark?
He's gonna go check that out right now. He's gonna go under a cover and think. So I guess there's a lot of things that we need to cover on here. So I would, in terms of the question of public opinion and foreign policy, I think there's a kind of interesting dynamic in there. So in some ways, there's a lot of data to talk about.
It does not glow in the dark.
Okay, thank you, Zal.
Thank you, Zal.
There is a lot of data that shows that at least in recent times, the influence of public opinion on foreign policy and on just general policy is taken in democratic countries, quote unquote democratic countries, liberal democratic countries, whatever you want to call them. Public opinion is less and less important. And we don't need to even look at foreign policy for this. We can look at domestic policy. Cuba mentioned this report earlier on, where they checked public opinions, policy preferences, and what preferences were actually engaged in by governments. And obviously, the conclusion was that what the public wants in general doesn't really matter. And I think that doubly counts increasingly for foreign policy as well. We have an enormous amount of war exhaustion in this country, not just about Israel, Palestine, but about the war on terror, the war in Afghanistan. That there was a lot of fatigue about that before that ended. American deployments around the world. We're seeing this not just on the kind of the left, but also on the right as well. There's a kind of war weariness in the country, but yet the United States obviously continues with its imperial policies. We see this in Britain. Look at the Labour government. You look at the Labour government and the coming to power, and then immediately adopting a set of policies that people don't like and people don't want. People don't want to take away the winter fuel allowances. So public opinion, on one hand, doesn't matter in shaping policies, but every so often, I think you do have like a kind of inculcate kind of anger at the system. Lectures in the chat pointing out, Brexit, Trump being elected, etc., etc. But what's remarkable, for example, Trump as a populist coming into power with these populist policies, once in power, ended up being kind of tainted by the system and passing a whole load of policies which any Republican would have passed. I mean, we see this with Meloni in Italy, coming to power as this kind of outsider, but then eventually being tamed by the system and, rallying behind the general political cause. So the kind of the amorphous deep states, quote, blob does manage to assimilate a lot of these populist challenges as well. So when we look at, now where public opinion does matter, I think actually perhaps ironically is perhaps more in many of these autocratic countries in the Middle East, whereby you don't have democratic representation. So these regimes, in order to shore up their political legitimacy, latch on to issues where there is a lot of popularity. So one of the things about the axis of resistance that I quote unquote axis of resistance is that whether their support for Palestinian is coming deep from their heart or is kind of a cynical political calculation, it is a way and a method to ensure up their legitimacy in the absence of kind of meaningful democratic participation in the government. So you, in effect, kind of win people over with a kind of by appealing to their popular sentiments. But how far can this go in reality? I mean, we look at a place like Turkey where there's a lot of hostility towards Israel, some of it based in kind of the disgust at Gaza, some of it based in kind of good old-fashioned anti-Semitism. But the reality is, like as much as the Turkish government rails against Israel, they could stop this war by tomorrow by shutting off the petroleum supply from Azerbaijan, which they do not, right? So I think a lot of the time, many of these appeals become symbolic and they become tools for regimes to in the Middle East to shore up their internal legitimacy. But when push comes to shove, it's difficult for them to take any meaningful action. So will popular public opinion affect this issue in the long term? Maybe not. We'll see how things go. But I think there is I think it is concerning, and I think this is perhaps my pessimism. I think Electra is perhaps more optimistic than me, but I think, with the surveillance technology, with, the kind of current political structure, protest and public opinion, and Vaughan mentions that in the 19th century, if you had like a mass demonstration, that presented a real concrete threat to the status quo, because that meant you could perhaps raise the military. Whereas today, that the balance of power between the state and society is so much more in favor of the state. That's not just in military terms, but in terms of surveillance, technologies of control, and things like that. And the irony, of course, is that the laboratory for many of these authoritarian technologies is Israel, which is deploying these technologies against the Palestinians, and then these are being imported back into the places like the United States to maintain social control. So I am very pessimistic that the old paradigm of public opinion and popular protest, its ability to change the orientation of things is limited. And even when it's successful, as in the case of Sri Lanka or in the Arab Spring, where they did overthrow regimes, very quickly you see a kind of return to the old order because there is no programmatic kind of there's no program or movement that can seize power and offer a positive vision of the future, only a negative vision. And I think that's like a very big issue that we need to come to terms with and come to face. And I'm a lot less sanguine about how changing global opinion about who the good guys or the bad guys are, because the reality is, for the majority of the world, it's always been that the Palestinians were the ones suffering and the ones who are the aggrieved party. It's only in Western Europe and in the United States that there's a kind of, oh, it's a complicated issue, or like overt pro-Israeli sentiment. So that's kind of my thoughts on this thing.
I hear children. I know it's a little late for Electra and Jean. Are you guys available for a little bit longer?
Yeah.
Okay. Over the past year, Palestinians have endured brutal bombings, systemic displacement, and an international community that largely turns a blind eye to their suffering. Yet despite these unimaginable hardships, Palestinians continue to resist, asserting their right to self-determination and sovereignty. What role can international solidarity, particularly from left movements, play in supporting the Palestinian cause and amplifying their voices, if at all? Who wants to go? Anyone?
I'll try to go.
Okay.
I think that as much as I may have sounded cynical earlier with my position on the rise of popular opinion on this issue, one thing is undeniable: the natural assumption in the veracity of Zionism is up to grabs in the United States and the West for the first time in my adult life. When I was a youth growing up in this country, it was assumed that the edicts of whatever Israel did went unchecked and unquestioned. And you just basically just grappled with it. But now to have whole movements, particularly of younger people, academics at universities, media personalities, question the legitimacy of not only what Israel is doing, but question the legitimacy of Zionism itself, to me, is something that should cause us to realize that there is something to be said for global solidarity against the oppression of the Palestinian people at this time. And that's all I have to say.
Kuba.
Well, I think that there's been some good points raised about the divergence between the level of coercive capacity, the organizational capacity, the threat that public protests, an organized, dissatisfied mass population, the relative weakness of that compared to the resources that states have at their disposal now compared to the 19th century. And I'd say that we shouldn't forget about the Arab Spring in all of this. There was a recent outpouring of public resentment, aggression, opposition to entrenched and established regimes throughout the Middle East that toppled many governments that had long-standing and deeply rooted authoritarian systems in places like Yemen, Egypt, Libya, of course. And nearly brought down Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And in all of those cases, you had a pretty close run of it. The conflict in Yemen, for instance, is ongoing. Same with Libya. In those places, the popular movements morphed into militia groups and were effective in challenging the state. Also, they were effective in showing people how terrible and terrible and terrible it is to actually get what you want in terms of overthrowing your government if you don't have a plan for what comes afterwards. I think that also for the governments that survived the Arab Spring, it was a massive learning opportunity and a great motivator for the evolution of techniques for co-optation, for control, for more sophisticated means of managing public dissatisfaction and public opinion than just repression, just ignoring it. And I think that Electra is absolutely right about the need for governments to address the reality of public opinion, but the techniques that are at their disposal aren't limited to trying to address public grievances. It's much more effective, actually, to canalize them against enemies that you already have and kind of jujitsu the anger and resentment of your population to weaponize it against the groups that you're already going after. So I think that we should recall that all of this is happening in a very uncertain information environment. The information war that Electra was alluding to is in a lot of ways ongoing. When you have Western governments talking about putting limitations and curbs on expression in order to combat disinformation, that's part of the information war. And that shows that there's an awareness from centers of authority, centers of state power, that they do have options, they can intervene, and that is far preferable to actually respecting people's opinions, respecting people's vote in the political process.
Derek Varn.
Yeah. There's a lot to say here. One, about national consolidations. I defer to Alexa's specialty on the Greeks, and I actually do admit that one is one that I find very fascinating because it goes very differently than, say, the consolidation of national identity in Italy and or Germany in the same time period, which was for many certain German ethnicities actually somewhat genocidal. The history of national consolidation is a bloody affair, and after the Shoah, a lot of the stuff put into the genocide accords were aimed at basically stopping national consolidation for pretty much anybody. And I think we often miss the expansion of the definition of genocide in the UN resolutions, which almost all nations on Earth are guilty of when you consider also cultural erasure as part of that definition. Which is not to say that what's happening in Israel is not almost uniquely. We haven't seen this kind of thing since World War II. The situation that is most analogous in the percentage of the population dead in Gaza and the West Bank is what the Germans did to Belarus in World War II. Now, we haven't seen anything like that in terms of war that has World War II style population decimation. We haven't seen that since almost World War II. So yeah, the system's in decline, which is why you're seeing this, but it's also very hard to predict how any of this is going to play out. We've had many populist revolts and takeovers of government. They're almost all neutralized immediately. Either by international pressure, because we are still in an international system, or by not fully dealing with their internal contradictory bureaucratic elements, like in Egypt, which I lived through the consolidation of the return to the norms. So that's something I can speak a lot about. The people who think World War III is around the corner have to also start dealing with the fact that that means you will not survive. Unless you take the most optimistic purview of how that plays out, most of the peoples on Earth will be at very, very low population sizes if you have a nuclear war. And the idea that you won't eventually in a world war, if you see this expanding to that, seems to me to be mathematically illiterate. So the stakes here are high. The highness of the stakes actually is something that I think we need to sit with a little bit more, because I don't see how. I'm going to be actually quite frank. Without the change of positions in Israel, and a willingness to work with Palestinians, that you don't have a wider war. And I don't see how that wider war does not tie up great powers in direct opposition to each other, all of whom are nuclear armed. And the game theoretic calculus on multipolarity, which is the system we objectively live in already, tends towards violence. How big the violence is a debate within international relations specialists. What kinds of ways these empires go at each other when you have a declining global imperial hegemon and you have several mini empires in the realms is also unknown. And the other thing that you have to factor in is the entire system of global capitalism, not just U.S. hegemony, is tied into this. So until you have something to replace that, you are dealing with a global decline with multiple powers operating from weaker economic grounds to do so, which definitely increases the potentiality for violence. But when we talk about this, we have to be quite serious that you either need a UN peacekeeping force that can go in with real teeth and settle this, or we have to admit that the way out of this is a regional war. And the way that regional war plays out, it's going to depend on how directly the great powers get involved. So we can tell ourselves a lot of things about the nature of democracy. I think the 19th century experiments are actually kind of being turned back. But I also think that we have to be quite direct here in looking at the fact that we're going to see a lot of stranger and stranger and stranger responses to this as all kinds of realignments happen. I don't see hardly anybody being able to reverse that unpopular opinion alone. And I don't think anyone here, including Lecter, is saying that. But we have to remind ourselves what these things mean when we say them. All right. There were democratic off-ramps at various times, but I don't know that there is one right now where one power is just going to unilaterally end this without the full possibility of war.
Electra? You're muted. You're muted. Electra, you're muted.
Yeah, I said, given that I'm the only woman on the panel here, I feel like I have to speak a little bit more to have some gender equality quota satisfied. I'm trying to be sarcastic about like a very devastating topic. And look, all of you raise wonderful points, right? That I fully agree on the essence of it. I guess my analysis was a little bit confusing, perhaps, because I'm not talking about what's going to happen this month or next month or even next year. It's more of a long-term or macro analysis type of approach. That the bottom line is that this is a system in decline. The post-World War II or the post-Cold War order is like collapsing, and absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Nobody really knows what's going to happen. But the fact that the very survival of the UN, the United Nations, may depend on the issue of Gaza, of Palestine, is huge. And I do not take that lightly. No, I fully agree with you that we cannot be callous about what's happening, because if everything goes wrong and we are indeed marching towards a full-scale war, this is going to be a war that involves nuclear weapons, right? Whether we call it World War III or even another escalation of regional dynamics and different actors becoming involved in everything. Even an accident would suffice for like a catastrophe to happen. So everything I was saying before is not a solution for what's happening right now. Let me clarify that. In the long term, I think that for this international community or order, or the US as a global superpower, if you like, to survive, we really need to take into account like how important populism is and to use it accordingly. Let me say one thing. This is something the right wing does very well, right? Why is right wing populism so much more successful in having real results than left wing populism? I think it's important for all of us to start asking this question to ourselves, because some of it is, of course, that it is easier for establishments, that Cuba made an excellent point, it's easier for establishments to use right-wing populism, even if it's superficially turning against them. But I think a big part of it is also that we on the left have become a little too elitist. We don't really believe in anything other than a sinister analysis of
I mean, I think you're talking about certain people, right? There's definitely certain people in
no,
our
seriously, I
circle
would
that shall
include
remain
myself as
nameless.
well. I would include
Yeah.
myself as well into that
Really?
group to a certain extent. I'm trying to overcome it, but there is something to be said about why is the left failing in terms of populism. Maybe because we don't believe in it. We don't believe in the people. We're too cynical, right, about our examination of the special interests and everything. Well, the right wing doesn't seem to have that problem. They push every crazy thing that comes to their mind, and they have such power of conviction that they somehow manage to see it through. So right now, we are faced with a truly existential moment for the US and the rest of the world, I would argue. And not necessarily because it's the only plausible scenario, but the fact that the total war is becoming a plausible scenario is devastating. I fully agree with that. We have to understand what the stakes are. And when we have UN, systemic, corrupt bureaucrats saying in every way that they can that the future of the international order depends on Palestine right now, we can't fail there. If we fail there, we fail everywhere. And look, I'm no supporter or fan of American imperialism. I do hope that at least as much is abundantly clear. But if the US continues to manifest such a scary um, such scary incompetence, right, and impotence, and forget about real feelings and empathy and humanity and all that. Just out of a pragmatic calculation of how high the stakes are, if the US continues to prove that our decline as a global superpower is irreversible, it's going to be mayhem, right? So for now, this disgusting international order and the rule of law is all we have for now. So if we do not defend that somehow, if we do not take it into account, and if we do not try to reestablish, we're not talking about a revolution, some type of a balance that is not pushing all of us collectively towards disaster, I don't know, like things are going to be bad. This is not a sustainable situation. This is the only thing I guess I disagree with Eugene truly on, that this is not business as usual. The scale of it all is just unprecedented. Yeah, that's it, I guess. Thank you.
Gene, did you want to respond to that, or?
I mean, I want to ask Electro, what do you mean when you say the scale is unprecedented? I mean, we've seen. Go ahead.
The scale of atrocity, I mean, again, as mentioned before, we haven't seen such violence and such cruelty published on social media. I'm sorry, it's the first genocide that's broadcasted on social media. First of all,
wait, let me just respond to that, because we have we have seen these levels of atrocities in the last 10 years. I've been sitting here watching the Syrian civil war and the barbarism of the Syrian civil war. We have these conflicts. The difference is not in the intensity of the violence. The intensity of the violence, it is very intense violence, but it's not. That's not what marks this atrocity out as being specific. What marks this atrocity out as being specific is the gaslighting pertaining to what is happening. No one except lunatics out there are going on acting like the things that took place in Syria were good, or like that it was fine, or like, the kind of atrocities that the barrel bombing of civilians, people aren't going out there. And not only, it's not like if you go into a place and say like, hey, Bashar al-Assad is like a criminal, he's like done all these horrible things, that you will lose your job, right? The difference is when you say that about like Israel is doing this kind of thing, then you're suddenly in threat. So the question is not the intensity or the uniqueness of this violence. I think it's very important to point out that, this kind, we've seen over the last 20 years, horrific levels of violence across the Middle East, in places like Yemen, in places like Sudan, in places like Syria, in places like Iraq. I mean, did we forget all these things? But what marks it? So Israel is, I see the violence in Israel as part of this general degeneration in the Middle East into sectarian violence, right? The difference in this case is that you have, in effect, a kind of sectarian militia armed with like the latest US weapons and defended politically and diplomatically in the West. So the question is less the atrocities, but more the pure gaslighting and inability to discuss this issue rationally. When I hear people, the Zionist defense will be like, well, Israel is scrutinized and critiqued in a way that other countries are in the Middle East. But the point is like, well, nobody or very few people are sitting there and saying like, well, the Bashar al-Assad regime is just defending itself by mass murdering people across the country. I mean, obviously it's a complicated civil war, et cetera, et cetera. But people aren't defending that in the same way in the mainstream and shutting down any conversation on that. I mean, part of the reason I think that I think many people get frustrated, many people who are critical of Israel get frustrated with the discourse that takes place on it is the pure gaslighting, right? I see you can see this with think tanks, right? You have all these Arab American and Arab scholars who worked in the think tank industry, who came out as commentators on what's going on in Iraq, what's going on in Syria, what's going on in Yemen. And these people, like are liberals, right? Generally kind of like, they're not like anti-imperialists, but, they're critical of Israel, right? And suddenly they've discovered, wait, you were all fine with us critiquing, critiquing the crimes of this group in the Middle East, and suddenly when we're just applying the same standards to what Israel is doing, suddenly we're called anti-Semites and we're called racist. So like I think the thing that drives people crazy, right? The things that drives people crazy about this is like we're seeing these horrific levels of violence, which in other very similar situations, right? Nobody has a problem with you critiquing, right? They may disagree with you on this, but then suddenly when you apply those same standards to Israel, suddenly you are persona non grata. And I think that's like a critical point to understand about this, because I don't think the violence Israel is imposing is like some kind of unique violence that we've never seen even in our recent history. I think we've seen this type of bloody sectarian violence across the Middle East intensifying for the last 20 years. But what we haven't seen is just the pure disconnect between what we are seeing, right, and then the official discourse that's coming out, and not just the official discourse that downplays it. It's not just like in Saudi Arabia where they just don't talk about the things. They're like, Saudi. No one's gonna like Saudi Arabia is a U.S. ally, but you're not going to lose your job if you suddenly say MBS, is a bad guy, or they have bad women rights in things. Nobody's really going to criticize me if I criticize Turkey, right? And that's a Western ally as well. But suddenly, in this case of Israel, when you're criticizing very intense violence that in any other situation people would be perfectly okay with you criticizing, suddenly this becomes like this becomes a do or die issue, and you can like face serious social consequences.
I want to say something. First of all, I fully agree on the essence of your argument, actually, but maybe that was like valid at the beginning, Gina. Like at this point, they have broken every single record we can think of. Most like UN staffers assassinated in cold blood, most doctors, most hospitals, right? So there is a limit. Most international law violations, especially after Lebanon. It just like it continues to escalate. And at some point, I mean, we're not comparing atrocities. I fully agree with you that this is far from the only atrocity happening. But the more this continues, the more we break all kinds of morbid records here as to most children killed in a conflict in recent history. I mean, compared, right? I keep repeating that statistic because it speaks volumes. More children have been killed in Gaza alone in the past 9 months than in the rest of the world, in all of these devastating conflicts, in the past 4 years combined. More UN staffers have been murdered. More doctors, more journalists, extremely important, more academics. So I think I fully agree with the essence of what you're saying, but at this point, we're also reaching an unprecedented scale in terms of the actual atrocity levels and complete disregard for any international norm, right? That is like spitting on the face of the international community, like really as a statement that we will carpet bomb Beirut just because. And we will have the demented president of the United States making a statement as how we have the right to carpet bomb the capital city of a sovereign nation because they're not a real nation, are they? As opposed to us. It's ridiculous. I'm sorry. It's ridiculous. The way Israel is going about it is ridiculous and thereby, I believe, self-destructive. But the essence of your comment is I fully agree on, and it's excellent. Yes, you're absolutely right. It is the gaslighting. It is the double standards. It's the fact that I don't care, for instance, what a big war criminal Putin is. He is a gigantic war criminal. But I'm also not Russian, right? I'm American. So I do have a problem with how my money is spent, with the genocide I finance, and what my government does. I do have a problem with all of these things, but I mostly have a problem with the genocide I personally, as an American citizen, become complicit in as we speak because of the failures of my own government to represent me personally in any decent way before pointing the finger to all the other warlords and autocrats and war criminals, etc., right? So obviously this is personal for us. This is 100% something that we should own. And the gaslighting is just, as you said, Turkey, right? It's the country with the biggest number of journalists in prison, I believe. And honestly, the coverage in the US is less objective than the coverage in Turkey, as far as I am concerned, regarding mainstream media. So that's an excellent point. Thank you. I fully agree with that, right? The gaslighting and whose genocide is the genocide under scrutiny makes all the difference. We are complicit. This is what we should be focusing on. And to conclude, and I will leave it there and promise I won't say anything else regarding the war of information and all that, because in a way what you're saying, I think proves that at least some of what I was saying about how the discourse matters and how information is important, and this is something that pisses people off at the end of the day, about all kinds of things, is a somewhat valid argument. And when you see me here, right, with my QFIA and all that, why am I doing this deliberately? It's not only about Gaza. And I wouldn't be the person who would identify first and foremost with Palestine before this current escalation, because as you said, there are so many other issues that one could focus on in the Middle East and in general. But right now, the Palestinians have managed, and this is their success. This is why I am saying they will win this war eventually, if we don't destroy humanity as we know it before. But eventually, I think their main victory is that they have managed to make people pay attention. They resisted enough, they fought back enough to stop their complete annihilation, and the world is paying attention. The world is not paying attention to Sudan, and we should. The world is not paying attention to all kinds of other issues, right? But they are paying attention to Palestine. So they played this or really fought about their own independence in a way that proves, in my words, literacy. They do understand, according to me, what the 21st century is all about. No, it's not a return to the 19th century. It's an entirely different type of geopolitics and ideologies we're talking about, but they prove that they have literacy as to how to force people to pay attention to them. And that's not a small thing. And those of us who support Palestine right now or make Palestine a point of reference care terribly about everything, right? Because it is not only the Israeli apartheid, it's also Saudi Arabia, it's also the failure, not failure, but the fact that the United States of America made sure that the Arab Spring would fail. The Arab Spring failed because we forced dictators to take over, right? We were not the only factor, but we directly interfered with what was going on in these regions after the revolutions. God forbid the people of the Middle East figure it out by themselves. Let's make sure we keep them under our understanding of what order is. Let's establish a new dictator in Egypt. Let's establish, our own people everywhere. And this is precisely the problem. This is the tip of the iceberg, but this is what people see. And this is precisely the victory of Gaza. Because if you question the Israeli apartheid, then you question the whole balance of terror we have established over the whole Middle East, at times in collaboration and at times in conflict with regional warlords, autocrats, criminals, and everything in between. So
I just want to add a couple of things. One, in order to defend the establishment international order, I would point out that surprisingly, the International Criminal Court has come out looking very responsible and even-handed in all this. The South African case was taken up and was adjudicated responsibly and fairly. And I think that that's part of what you're saying about a shift in the global consensus. And outside of the West, you have a very strong international recognition that whatever the particular pragmatic geopolitics of siding with Israel or with the has axis of resistance, the forces fighting Israel, the sympathy of the majority of the world population, especially in the global South, is with Palestine. That's colored a little by local relations with Muslim communities, but by and large, it's very difficult to find any country, any major leaders outside of the global West that will give Israel diplomatic cover for anything it's doing. The friendliest thing you can do is just change the subject, but it's hard to go on record being like Israel has a right to defend itself and not be laughed out of the room. But on the other side, there is a risk when you let a region like the Middle East sort of let organic forces reconfigure the borders, reconfigure the security situation, solve regional problems themselves. Because one of the great political startups following the Arab Spring was ISIS. And those guys, they had an incredible run before they got shut down. But I would argue that that wasn't necessarily a wonderful development for the region. And one of the worst effects of all of this duplicity on the part of the United States, first and foremost, the double standards in support of Israel, the gaslighting, the fact that the United States has gone so far in supporting Israel that it has had to shred parts of the very international rules-based system that it was supposed to be the creator, founder, and protector of, right? It's all about human rights and the rules-based system, the international community and international law. When Ukraine or the People's Republic, when it's about Ukraine and Russian aggression, or Taiwan and the 9-dash line, or the PRC, but as soon as we touch on Israel, all of that goes out the window. And that hypocrisy is one of the main delegitimizing forces that lead to support for groups that just want to shred the whole thing. And unfortunately, I think we're in a situation where there's no obvious good guy. Like, even if the forces that are aligned to stop Israel from what they're doing in Gaza, what they're doing in southern Lebanon, absolute atrocities, no excuse for it. But the groups that they're fighting don't necessarily have a less bloody vision for the future of the Middle East. It's just a different set of people shedding the blood.
I disagree with that completely. How does Palestinians in Gaza have a more bloody vision for what's going on in the world? How does Lebanon, as a country, which is, by the way, 1/3 Christian, how does it have a more bloody vision for what's going on in the world than?
I don't think that Gaza. I don't think that the Palestinians have a vote. I don't think that the Lebanese have a vote. The question is, who are the groups that have organized coercive capability? Who are the ones that can do the fighting? And in the case of Gaza, that was Hamas. And in the case of Lebanon, the Lebanese army actually is in an extremely challenging position because they're trying to stay out of a conflict that the Israelis have brought into their own country. I don't even think Hezbollah would be interested in support from the Lebanese military. I agree that when you look at populations, it's very different, but populations aren't the actors here. The actors are the political forces with those coercive arms.
Yeah, but these are guerrilla forces that are reflexive in nature, that act in reaction to the oppressive powers of Israel in their proximity. They are not nation states. They are not long-term strategic in terms of building infrastructure within the capacity to ideologically dictate the policies of large areas. Now you can
I mean, I
argue,
disagree with that.
you
The
can argue
whole concept of
Hamas.
the axis of resistance is about building up
Who
that
created
type of.
who created that terminology comes out of the West.
That terminology comes out of Iran.
Axis of resistance?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, okay. Well, if it's an axis of resistance, what is it resisting? It's legitimately resisting the powers of the West that have been antagonizing it since the revolution.
You can have a very legitimate cause that nonetheless ends in a million innocent people dead. And that's, and I think that with Hezbollah and Hamas, we've seen what Hamas does when they have a chance. And I don't feel the need to dwell on it, but the trigger for this event, for the Israeli incursion into Gaza, all of the conflict and all the bloodshed, was a heinous crime committed by Hamas. And I'm very sympathetic to the argument that peace and pacifism have gotten the Palestinians nowhere, but we're looking at the difference between one brutal, violent force and another.
To compare the capacity to do damage of Hamas to the IDF in the state of Israel and its military capacity, which has nuclear weapons, by the way, is absolutely
so you're offended by my moral equivalency.
It's ridiculous.
It's ironic hearing that, because I'm used to hearing that from defenders of Israel, that how dare you imply that there's anything similar between these two groups. But frankly, I see the IDF and I see ideological ethno-militias. And that was Gene's whole point earlier, that understanding the IDF as a Middle Eastern ethno-militia, just one which is hyper capable because of its relationship with the West, helps make sense of the multi-sided dynamic.
My goal here is not to play, the marketing agent for either Hamas or Hezbollah. That's not my point. My point is that these organizations, these forces, do not come about in a vacuum. They come about as a consequence of profound amount of oppression by external Western allies and forces, i.e. the state of Israel, in laying waste to the lives of their civilian surrounding people, i.e. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, i.e. Lebanese people, and needing someone to be basically having the balls enough to take it to them to protect further damage and incursions into those states. Now, do they go into excessive points where they do things that are unjustifiable? Of course, I don't deny that. Do they do things that maybe be considered criminal on the international stage? Of course, I don't deny that. But these are not rational state actors. There's an old saying: one man's one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. I mean, you can make the argument that for example, in South Africa, many of the people around the time of that went to prison with Nelson Mandela was a terrorist. He was on the terrorist watch list when he went to prison. Nelson Mandela was actually planning the names of people who would be assassinated at one point as a militant in South Africa. He was considered a terrorist. So my position is that one man's terrorist can be another person's freedom fighter, and we shouldn't all of a sudden be willing to just all of a sudden say, all of Hamas is horrible. They're just as annihilants. Yeah, Hamas doesn't exist and Hezbollah doesn't exist if there is not but for the state of Israel.
Frankly, I don't think that's true. The Ba'athist state of Syria exists without the need for Israel.
I would not make the same. That I don't think what the Ba'athist state of Israel of Iraq represents, or Syria represents, and what Hamas and Hezbollah are the same thing. Those are not nations. Hezbollah and Hamas are not nation states making policy decisions.
Hamas administered the Gaza Strip.
They did because of one election. But the thing is, though,
Hezbollah has been part of Lebanese governments and runs a
they are reactive military forces responding to the actions of Israel for large measure for the majority of their existences. That's been what they mostly were about.
Look, I'm concerned just as much with violence and atrocities carried out against Zionism as in its name. For me, the preoccupation is trying to minimize and eliminate all violence and atrocity. I don't think there are good victims or good killers.
And I'm not going to judge people who are trying to defend themselves when they're basically being financed by the United States against a nuclear power. I'm sorry, I'm not.
Well, I want to jump in here because, I think Electra's probably more sympathetic to Pascal's position, where I'm more sympathetic to Kuba's position. I mean, I think the point is there is a different, I think there's completely a confusion, and I see this confusion all the time, between understanding something analytically and justifying every single thing. So, for example, I could, in a general sense, of course, Palestinians and Lebanese people have the quote unquote right to defend themselves. I don't know what it means exactly, the right. They will defend themselves. It is just a fact of nature when people are oppressed and abused that they will defend, that they will engage in violent struggle. But that doesn't mean that we have to say, like, well, all types of struggle are illegitimate or right or appropriate. I think it's perfectly consistent to say that yes, like if we look at the history, Hezbollah is a product of the 1982 Israeli invasion. Shias in Lebanon tended to lean towards the Communist Party before that. In the face of an Israeli occupation, you see the emergence of Hezbollah as a resistance movement. But you can say exactly the same thing about ISIS as well. ISIS was a product of resistance to American imperialism, and then the civil war in Syria, etc. But that doesn't mean that every single act of quote unquote resistance of ISIS against like American imperialism or American aligned groups is defendable. I think that's a kind of dangerous path to go.
I look at ISIS.
I look
at ISIS as a counter-revolutionary movement, largely funded by Saudi Arabia to antagonize against the Arab Spring.
I'm sorry.
But it also emerges out of the resistance forces that developed in reaction to the American invasion of Iraq. That's just a fact. I mean, many of the cadre and leadership of that movement were parts of the ex-Ba'athist movement.
Sure, Jane, I would like to remind you that Hezbollah was actually fighting against ISIS. So, I mean, we're mixing up all kinds of irrelevant things. I'm sorry, but you cannot equate a guerrilla movement that exists because any voice of moderation has been either annihilated or imprisoned in Palestine and in Lebanon and everywhere else, with ISIS, who was, again, absolutely, I agree with that, was created because of our crimes in Iraq and how we mismanaged that situation. And then, the gates of hell were open. And, by the way, we were trafficking weapons to them as well, didn't we? Come on. It's just Hezbollah. And we're talking about Hezbollah in the 90s and the 80s. let me
Why
finish.
leftist
They
need to
had a
Let her
very
fin-
good
let-
record
let her-
in
let her
the
finish,
80s and
Jean.
the 90s. Hezbollah was a terrorist organization that was hated by Muslims, yes, because they were inflicting all kinds of terrible things, mainly on Muslims, right? But we also have to appreciate the transformation of all of these movements in the past 20 years or so, when quite frankly, they prove who are the real dummies in this situation, and that's us. Because we see the leader of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, and like he was a very charismatic person. Why? Because he wasn't acting as the irate terrorist. That's what we used to associate Hezbollah with in the 80s and the 90s anymore. He used very deliberately Gaza, because indisputably, if you focus on morality and ethics and terrorism and international law and all that, Gaza is an indefensible position for the West. So he used very deliberately Gaza and Palestine in order to, in a way, purify Hezbollah. And that was, again, on the war of information issue, masterfully done. So who in the Middle East right now doesn't feel that whoever fights against Israel's genocide is not on the right side of history, regardless of what their previous record was? And especially regarding Palestine, I mean, I feel we shouldn't conclude with that because this is offensive. Israel has for decades deliberately imprisoned, killed, annihilated any voice of moderation, any academic institution or group that could stand up for themselves and claim a different Palestine, while, as we all know, contributing to Hamas's growth, right? So they wanted to annihilate, they did annihilate any potential the Palestinians had to negotiate their self determination in terms of international law. It's not that the Palestinians couldn't do that. They could absolutely do that. And even in these circumstances, they're doing a better job than anybody else, quite frankly. It's offensive for us to pretend that, oh my God, if the good Westerners don't step in to save these barbaric tribes from themselves, God forbid what's going to happen. And I was writing a bunch of things on the chat because I thought I was backstage. But given that I'm on stage again, I mean, obviously, war is a barbaric expression of human nature, right? Of the human existence, of the human experiment, whatever you want to call it. And I was giving you the example of our civil war. That's what made America. That's what made every single nation state anywhere in the world, with the exception of Switzerland, maybe. But, it's bloody, barbaric confrontations. That's how it works, especially if it's a revolution against a superior, militarily and financially speaking, regime, whatever you want to call it, empire, international community. Obviously, but eventually, clearly, these are not the people who establish a political regime. So what we're claiming right now is that the peoples collectively of the Middle East are completely incapable to have a moderate, right, democracy, or to elect their own leaders, or to negotiate this in any other way. But
Isn't this the George W. Bush position on Iraq?
excuse me, disagrees with factually everything that has happened in recent history. Because most of these bloody conflicts exist because we finance them, provide the weapons, and manipulate the situation to such an extent that local actors are left with no other option. This is a very patronizing understanding of the world, and I do have a big problem with that, philosophically speaking.
I
And
believe
factually,
that
it is the wrong analysis, because all of the conflicts you referred to and all of these terrorist organizations popped up precisely because of American interventions, not despite them.
Okay, well,
Okay, so it's actually wrong.
can Cuba respond?
Well, first of all, the position that, look, Arabs deserve democracy too. It's patronizing to what I'm hearing. It's strange to me because this is clearly supposed to be an anti-imperialist line, but it was also the neocon line justifying the invasion of Iraq. And the lesson that I assumed that everybody carried from the failure of the American intervention there was that you have to pay attention to the actual condition of countries before picking sides and declaring your intention to rework their politics. And the existing conditions throughout the Middle East, well, where's the optimism? Where are the forces that would create a better future if Israel was defeated? I'm anxious about that. I'm anxious about what fills a vacuum in the political structure of the Middle East. Look at what happened when Gaddafi was brought down in Libya. It's another situation where leaving it up to the local people sounded like a great idea, but actually led to catastrophic consequences for the country and the entire region. So I think that I'm very sympathetic to arguments that the West should be doing a lot less in the Middle East. I'm very sympathetic to the position that the West should stop supporting governments like Israel, especially in the middle of a conflict like what we're seeing in Gaza and southern Lebanon, that the West should not be arming countries engaged in active genocide or ethnic cleansing. Absolutely, this is all true. However, I don't think that we should be naive about the circumstances that exist outside of the Western camp, and I don't think that we should be naive about the intents or character of the so-called axis of resistance. Just because somebody is fighting against terrible evil doesn't mean that they're intrinsically noble or superior. And I agree, yeah, many countries, the United States was formed through the brutality of the Civil War and the American Revolution. And occasionally that's necessary, right? Occasionally things like World War II, in order to stop terribly repressive, brutal regimes, violence is necessary, warfare is necessary. But we all know how destructive all of these great political conflicts have been, regardless of their legacies. And if it's possible to reach a humane outcome without going through the valley of death, then obviously that would be the ideal, the optimum solution. And right now, frankly, the situation is so bad that every path, whether to more stable and durable peace or to the absolute limits of barbarity, seems to be going through the valley of death, at least in the Levant.
I just want to say there's some comments that I do want to address. Hold on, God damn it.
I want to see what the Angry Badger has to say, because he's badgering up down there.
I just want to address some comments. There's people that are kind of listening to this as some sort of debate where points are scored, and there's winners and losers. It's almost as if people have never had conversations without there having to be some sort of victory in the outcome of said conversation.
Well, no, that's not true, Jason. It's like there's two types of conversation. There's debates, but the other type of conversation is called the jerk de cycler, as they say.
Well, we can have conversations and we can disagree without there having to be winners and losers, because ultimately the winner and loser, in your opinion, is just going to be whoever sides with how you feel. This is also something that a lot of people have an emotional attachment to. We have to keep that in mind as well. And in these conversations that are going to get extremely nuanced, no one wants nuance. Show me who the good guy is, show me who the bad guy is, and let me just yell about it for the next hour and a half. So Derek, that being said.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this discussion of the international order, which has actually not necessarily been on the wrong side of history, whatever the fuck that means. I don't know what that means. But I want to point out that everything we're talking about is a symptom of the establishment of said international order, even going back to one that I mentioned about the Mizrahi and the way that played out and its point in Israeli fervor. That is a result of the Balfour Declaration. That is a result of European incursions into breaking up the Ottoman space, some of which is organic, some of which is not. And I agree with Electra that the nation states that formed were largely the groups that had like a something like an intellectual and popular support tradition, but we see also where that was not worked out. Iraq, the states that actually we see the most sectarian conflict in. And I'm also going to agree with Electra on another thing, that we have seen these states strategically destabilized by the West, trying to do actually what powers like Nasser did in the Cold War, but with much more asymmetrical powers, with much weaker powers. So, I mean, you know, if you looked at some of these conflicts in the Middle East, where wasn't there U.S. intelligent money? Like it was on all sides, right? I think the thing that seems to be at root here for listening to this from me is, what do we do when the international order is completely and totally decayed by the people who established it? All right, the people who violated the whole scenario that led to all this stuff coming up in the first place was the Euro-American accesses. It's the French in Africa and us pretty much everywhere else. And we established this rules-based international order to start delegitimizing it as late as the 1990s. Like, we did that. The smaller actors in this, Nasrallah shifted Hezbollah's strategy to more of a dual power campaign. I will say, I was a little bit taken aback by pretending that any want for local democracy is the same as when neoconservatives force it through bombings and very much are using that as a rhetoric. Now, look, I don't think anyone, if I'm quite frank, who's a major power actually gives a shit about democracy. All right. But it is confusing to me that when we say that these people should rule ourselves, and we look at the destabilization of these regions, going back to the end of the caliphates and the imposition of a Westphalian system on them, which has led to tons of violence, that has a 200-year history here. You know, Palestine is where it's the least deniable, right? That this is where this is going to end up. To me, arguing about the morality of the actors is beyond the point, or arguing about whether or not we would have to like what these regions pick is beyond the point, because we are part of why they are picking these things. And so, we could talk about what Hamas wants. I'm not a super big fan of the Muslim Brotherhood. However, I will say that in each instance where I've seen the Brotherhood go certain ways, I mean, and I'm thinking about what I saw in Egypt, the outside interference and the frankly fucking with both sides element of this lost the U.S. middle class legitimacy in Egypt. It led to large parts of the Brotherhood being imprisoned or killed. I mean, I literally lived across the street from where Morrissey died a year and a half after I left. Or it led to certain other people going to different groups in desperation. I mean, there was people in the around Aswan going over to declare informal allegiance to the Islamic State after the Brotherhood was suppressed so thoroughly, and that led to massive incursions by the Egyptian government, some of which, by the way, hurt Westerners, which you weren't reported on in the United States. There is a Mexican consulate group who took a tourist trip to the White Desert, who were bombed by the Al-Sisi government, and it included having Americans in the entourage, and the U.S. said nothing about it. I heard no reports about it in the United States for 2 whole fucking years. So, like, the idea with Palestine, it makes all this gaslighting and all this stuff kind of just obvious. Whereas in these other areas, it's not. I mean, if people talk about Gaddafi. Why did the West turn on Gaddafi? Gaddafi's popularity or unpopularity can be debated about by leftists all day, and it will be. All right. What I know about that situation is rather ugly on all sides. But what I can tell you is the thing about Gaddafi is he cooperated with the Western powers, and that still happened.
Mm-hmm.
So, at this point, how do we talk about anyone trusting anybody in this situation? And since international law, I always hear people say, oh, it's illegal against international law. International law is treaty obligations. All right. That's what holds international law together. There's no grand, unified, anything. I mean, the United States, for example, it can respect certain judgments by the International Court of Justice. There's other things that it can completely disregard because there are things that they're signatory to enforcing, but not signatory to being enforced by us, and that is totally legal. International law is about the agreement of these powers in the first place. We can talk about it till we're blue in the face, but if people don't believe it in anymore, it doesn't exist effectively, which Palestine, to me, has made it very clear. International law, as we've talked about it and referred to it for the last century, is pretty much out of steam. What that means for us is going to be, what are you going to do in the time of monsters, because you're going to live through it regardless.
Oof. And you're saying that what would be the time of monsters for you, Derek? Define that for a little bit for me.
The potentiality for violence goes up exponentially in these time periods historically. The 19th century actually was a perfect example of that. The 13th century is another, in Europe anyway. The many kingdoms period in China is another. I don't want to wax poetic about unipolarity because I think it was actually kind of awful for the world. But we do have to admit that what we see in these breakdowns are warlords. They are war. All right. The places that are relatively stable will not see them for a long time. And by the way, I mean, when people are like, "Oh, the empire is weakening," the United States empire has probably been weakening since it existed. That's true for most empires. Their peak is pretty early. But if we ask ourselves where we're going to end up, I do think a lot of it's ugly. But I don't know what you're going to do about it at this point. What we have to hope to do is that none of these powers, and to remind everyone, Israel has 29 nukes that we know of, that none of these powers decide to escalate it in a world existential way. Mutually assured destruction has actually come back into play in a real way in all this, but there's a limit to that. And I think we could easily see it. And so my point is, what are we going to do in response to it? Because we can talk about, till we're blue in the face about what these groups really want to do. A lot of them probably do want to do ugly things. All right. And there's also, a lot of them are also not unified in what they actually want. I mean, I've read the Hamas chart. I went through when this war started and actually decided to educate myself and read the various Hamas charters in revision.
And what did you think?
They're radically different from time period to time period. They actually do become more inclusive. They have they do also make they have a weird double language of both inclusion and like almost left-wing appeals to international solidarity and kind of like left bourgeois nationalism, but also there is some stuff about the unification of the Ummah and Islamism in there as well. In the early charters, they are pretty reactionary charters, all right? But what you see here is that the idea that we can even talk about Hamas as a unified entity with a singular ideology is belabored by their own history of revising their founding documents. There is an attempt in the most recent one to even make some concessions to the Mizrahi situation and from and to what we in other times before the state of Israel would have called Palestinian Jews. That is totally absent from the 88 one that people like the neoconservatives like to bring up, which, but I mean, it's full of anti-Semitic interpretations of Muslim surahs that are actually non-standard, even not halakhically. I'm being Jewish here, hadithically, but nonetheless, I mean, all these movements are contradictory too. If we try to essentialize them in any one way, I think we're going to misunderstand that they are also contested ground. And that is to add to the fact that we know that the Israeli government really did try to help support Hamas because they thought it would help them in the eyes of, justify what they do in the eyes of the international community. That's not even hidden anymore. And the impunity in which the Israeli government, the IDF, will post massacres on TikTok themselves, that tells me that the fear of international law is no longer there. It's just gone. I mean, even the United States tried to hide that shit in the Iraq War. Yeah. The IDF does not.
Being that, okay, I want to ask you guys all this. Because I think we all agree. Can we all say we agree on this, that none of us want this stuff to happen here? I think there's this idea that because, again, someone wants to add a certain amount of like historic nuance to the conversation, then all of a sudden you are a, what's the word? Lapdog for a certain party or some bullshit like that. We're all friends in real life. And we all agree ideologically, I believe, for the most part. But we can have these disagreements here or conversations, these dialectics, if you will. This is the whole thing. And again, these aren't debates as much as they are dialectics with your friends online in front of a whole bunch of people that do influence the conversation. I have to admit, the commenters influence the conversation because everybody's eye, you can see the corner of their eye. They're seeing someone go, "Hey, fuck off, guy. I hate that guy. That chick is stupid. Gene sucks." Right? We all see that. Don't think you guys aren't adding to the conversation and to a certain degree influencing what people say. I just want to get our conversation kind of back on track where we are not acknowledging some of the crowd, if you will, because if we were all sitting together in a bar talking shit, we'd be chuckling a little bit more. We'd be disagreeing louder. Derek would slam a table every so often, but we'd still have this conversation, right?
I mean, one thing I want to add, Jason, is like, from my perspective, the character, I have my opinions on the character of political movements like Hamas and Hezbollah, etc., etc. I have my opinions on the political character of, the Israeli state. But, those are my opinions and interpretations of those movements, trying to like look at them, quote unquote, objectively and historically, etc., etc. My perspective on, what it means for people in, let's say, in the United States, like us as not as like a political scientist or a historian, but as a citizen, or in my case, a resident of the United States. My whole point has been, in a way, getting into the debate of whether Hamas is good or whether Hamas is bad, who is to blame for this group coming into being, that group. Those are historical debates that I think, we should have those debates in an intellectual sense. But politically speaking, the question from my perspective, and I think Kuba would probably agree with me on this, is like, those debates are actually irrelevant to what our position as people who live in the United States should be, which is like, our government is funding one side in this violence, right?
Yes.
And we don't want our government to be involved in funding that side in its atrocities. Hamas might be a very bad organization or a good organization. Hezbollah might be a bad organization or a good organization. But the reality is, Israel is inflicting a collective punishment on the Palestinian people, as well as the people of South Lebanon, for the actions of these political groups. And the fact that, they, as much as the Israelis complain about, Lebanese sovereignty, and they should, the Lebanese army should crush Hezbollah, they're in violation of international law. They maintain an occupation that has been occupation for over 50 years. And for the first 20 years of that occupation, Palestinians were in the West Bank of Gaza and were relatively demobilized. So, of course, Israel has created these conditions that lead to the rise of these groups, which I think probably are political dead ends in a certain sense. But that is irrelevant to the question of what an American citizen should do, which is just very simple. It's like, America needs to not be sending billions of dollars over to Israel to fund and support these kind of activities.
I would, what I would like to see is whatever policy Western countries have towards Israel should be entirely symmetrical with their policy towards Palestine and their policy towards Lebanon. Meaning, if you're sending $60 billion worth of military aid to Israel, you should also be sending $60 billion to the Palestinian Authority, and you should also be sending $60 billion to Lebanon. If you don't want those weapons in the hands of the Palestinian Authority or Lebanon, then send less to the Israelis as well. Similarly, if you are giving preferential access to visas for Israeli citizens, you should behave the same way towards the Palestinians and towards the Lebanese. This is not a Western conflict, and the West created the conditions for this terrible, terrible nightmare situation, and has been an unfair and dishonest broker in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. So I think that there should just be a baseline symmetrical relationship with the entities, the belligerents in question, and other than that, the West should have nothing to do with it. In this, I'm anxious about what the local actors should do, but I am not implying that the Western force should go in there to sort it out.
Pascal Robert.
Free Palestine.
That's what you're gonna do. You're gonna yell that out like a college student. That's what you're gonna do.
Hey, yo, man, free Palestine. Yo, man,
That's what you're gonna do. That's what you're gonna do. You're gonna sit there.
Free Palestine, man.
Wow. All these people, all these paid patrons that want to hear you say something profound.
I mean, listen, man. I'm only very honest with you. By the way, Cuba, I don't want you to think that I was personally assailing your position there when we had a brief disagreement. I mean, listen, I have, I've been to the Middle East. I've lived in Egypt for several times. I've been to Jordan. I've made my Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. I have several friends who are Palestinians. And, it's very emotional for me to see what's going on in this area, to see what's happening, and to hear what's happening. And for me, it's always clear what should be done. But that doesn't mean what's clear to me, based on my faith and beliefs, is necessarily in line to what a secular American audience or leftist audience wants to hear.
Yeah.
And and I recognize that and I realize that. But you know, for my sensibilities, the enemy is clear in this paradigm, and for me, I'm just happy that the Palestinian people are seeing some sense of humanity, their humanity being recognized at this moment.
Derek Varn, do you want to add something in closing? I feel horrible because I've kept you guys for 2 hours. I know Electra is a mom. Jean, as you can see,
I'm a mom.
the children have breached. The children have breached the room. I don't know how Electra stopped her breach. She must have a reinforced door, a series of iPads.
No, she probably has mom voice where if she says, "Hey, you guys better behave," they listen, right?
Do
Electra?
Greek moms throw shoes?
If you want to discuss my strategy here in childbreeding,
If you've got some tips, Electra, I could really help.
I guess I believe in polygamy. I have different dads to take care of their different offspring.
Smart. You divide up the labor.
Damn. Okay. There you go.
You need a lot of them to make
Electra's got her
real
daddy's working. She's got him doing the smart move, Electra. Smart.
She was like, I'm getting my weekends free. Derek Varn, what say you in closing?
I would say that we need to leave the region the hell alone. And if anything, I do not want to, a free Palestine. It would be, I think, an objective necessity for the world. I also don't. I'll be quite honest with you. The more I deal with it and look at it, I don't know where we end up going. I would love to be able to tell our audience that I thought that everything was going to be okay. I quite frankly don't. On that note, however, I don't want to end up in a muddle of ambivalence. I think we here need to do our best to end the situation and end our funding for the situation. I think that's something that we all agree on, or at least make sure that the funding is not asymmetrical towards Israel as some kind of a pragmatic compromise there. The way I feel about this, I'm similar to Pascal in that I've spent a lot of time in Egypt and I've spent time in the UAE and I've even been to Gaza before it was totally shut off, and I haven't spent a lot of time there though. I've seen it enough to feel very real to me. It's hard for me to say that I'm going to feel good about almost anything that happens in this. I mean, for me, I have known people who have perished on both sides because of my ethnicity and my proximity to the Middle East. It seems to me that despite that, it's very easy for me to keep a very clear eye on why this is happening and why we need to get the U.S. uninvolved, even though I don't know what levels we actually have to do that. And that's going to be the last thing I'm going to say on this.
Dr. Electra. I call you that because I don't want to butcher your last name. I'm going to butcher it. So, or I would just make up something Greek, and that might be racist. And I don't want to do that.
No, seriously. I just want to say how much I appreciate the conversation here, and that's important to us as well. At least to me, to have this conversation. So, especially when we disagree, right? Because this is important, needs to be addressed. I want to go back to Jean's point that at the end of the day, aside from analysis and how we say different things, as Americans, right, as an American audience, like we do participate in a genocide that undermines everything in a pragmatic way we are supposed to be about, and we are going to pay the price for it in very real ways, in terms of losing international influence, in terms of like messing up the global economy. That's if we avoid a major disaster, which is not certain, a full war, further escalation, etc., etc. So the bottom line is that to me, it's very simple. Our government is breaking the law, all kinds of laws, American laws, international law, and there is one big issue that we did not talk about, and I will just put it out there, and maybe we can revisit at some other point, like like weapon trafficking, right? Because there are economic incentives that influence our electoral system and that have absolutely nothing to do with geostrategic considerations of any kind. And to me, everything that's happening is so irrational and self-destructive, even from the perspective of pragmatic cynicism for the ruling Democrats, that the only explanation I can think of is that they're so invested financially in weapon manufacturing that, by the way, in the past year, they maximized their profit by 95%. And these are public data, right? That many of them have stocks and are investors in these companies that make billions from the onslaught. So at times it is as simple as that, and as brutal as that, and as crude as that. It's about short-term profit without even thinking about the long-term implications of anything. And that's terrifying. So in conclusion, it is very simple. When the government breaks the law in multiple ways, or the political establishment collectively, let's start with that. There should be accountability. It is ridiculous that we have surrendered all of our rights, even the right to say that no, it is not okay to steal 60 billions from the American people in order to profiteer from onslaughters and wars that they could lead to the destruction of the world as we know it. It is not okay to do that. To me, sometimes the conclusion should be simple and straightforward. Thank you.
Well, that was simple and straightforward. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me and the Central Committee. If you do enjoy what we do here, I am going to have to do a pitch because this is how we eat. If you do enjoy what we do here, become a patron for as little as $3 a month or $30 for the year. You can enjoy the champagne rooms that we do here. We usually just talk a lot more shit. But sometimes we have serious discussions like this too. But if you do enjoy these, definitely.
Have you ever invited a lecture to the champagne room?
That sounds like you're trying to get me too'd. I didn't Weinsteiner. No. I didn't Cosby or Weinsteiner. No, I did not. No.
Jesus.
You won't get me too, but you might get something, because as it's abundantly clear, I do have a temper that I'm withholding for now,
Right?
because this is
trying not to get
conversation.
I'm not. No, I did not. I've never been on a show with Electra because I was gone when she came on the first time. Oh. And I have now I have a no women allowed policy in the champagne room.
Are you trying to get me too?
I was gonna say, if you're trying to stop that, you just ended that.
I think you should hire Electra as your new co-host. She'll keep you on the straight and narrow with her Greek mom voice. Someone in the chat said that Greek moms have the Benny Gesserit voice, which I think is probably.
Will Electra sing?
Make a child freeze.
Right? Will Electra sing George Michael songs with me in the champagne room? That's the big question. That's the $1 million question.
Which George Michael songs?
Only songs from his
Wham
first
era.
two solo records. So once he gets the
Oh.
real manicured
when
beard,
he releases his album Older, which is where he did his like serious grown up music.
yeah. But we can sing Freedom 90 over and over again because that is one of my favorite songs.
Electra says in the chat nobody wants to hear her sing, but now I'm kind of just want to hear her sing.
That's how the kids know to
Trust me, fake humility is not one of my talents. I really mean it. Nobody wants to hear me sing. Even my kids, like, when
They
I
don't
try
wanna
to
hear you
do a
sing.
lullaby, they're like, no, that's okay.
But you can dance though, right?
I can. Yes.
Yeah.
Because
Electra,
we Middle Eastern women are very, and I will include myself to that, right? Why not? Because I am Greek and of Romani origin and all that. That's what we're known for. So let's continue to patronize the only woman in the
exactly. See,
chat
that's
here. As you said, are you trying to get
no, well,
me?
nobody wants to see Derek dance because I've seen Derek dancing.
Derek might be the only melanin deprived person here with some rhythm, man.
I have seen Kuba dance on his wedding. I think he's very.
You didn't dance at your wedding.
No, didn't you do this? Didn't you do?
No, he didn't dance at his wedding. No, you got him confused with Doug Lane.
Oh, Doug Lane dancing at the wedding, shaking his booty.
You got him confused with Ben Burgess.
Dropping it like it's hot.
Kuba did not dance. There was a no dance policy at Kuba's wedding.
I think everybody would want to see Ben Burgess dance and sing.
Did I tell you? Actually, side note of gossip bullshit. Ben agreed to get his haircut here in Mexico. So, and like we walked by a barbershop. We were going somewhere. He's like, "Oh, there's a barbershop." I was like, "Are you weren't fucking around? You're gonna let me take you into a fucking barbershop here and get a haircut?" He's like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Oh, fuck yeah, dude. We're gonna get you one of those third base fades." Are
you trying to give Ben like a
kid and play?
What do they call that? What do they call the haircut from the late 80s, early 90s, which makes your hair like a microphone?
High top fade.
Yeah, high top fade.
I want Ben Burgess to have a high top fade.
That's what I'm trying to do, and I'm pretty sure he's not watching right now. So that's my diabolical plan. So if you guys tune into GTAA,
where are you going to find a black barber in northern Mexico to get?
Dude, these Mexican barbers are fading cats up left and right. They got all these Negro fades here. It's crazy, man. They got parts in their eyebrows. It's some next level shit. So he agreed. He agreed to this shit, and I looked at him like, "Are you serious?" He goes, "Yeah. I'm going to get my haircut here. Why not? I live here." And I'm like,
time for a live stream.
That'll be interesting. Are you gonna get him dressing like a local too? Like, is he gonna wear something other than a t-shirt and a blazer? Like
Edgar fashions to get him dressing like an Edgar. I don't know. We both get our t-shirts from the same place. As you can see, this is an Exorcist t-shirt
from Target.
No, there's a store that sells bootleg horror movie and band shirts, and we can get them extremely inexpensively. So that's what we do on the weekends. We go shopping at the.
So Ben Burgess is now your new heterosexual life partner. Is that what's happened?
Kinda. It's weird. Kinda, yeah.
You go on dates together.
Yeah.
You double date.
Yeah. Double? Not yet.
Well, peeps, I need to head on out. So I got to get prepped for a wedding in a week, and I don't have time. So I will see you guys, and don't try to come to my wedding. Nobody is invited. And It's happening in the middle of nowhere in Utah, so you can't find me, and I will have a shotgun. All right, so
Is it like super pagan?
no, not necessarily. I just don't want anyone to be there. I have 2 witnesses that are legally necessary, and that is it.
Wait, hold on. You're getting married in 2 weeks?
He's getting married.
I've been married
Yeah.
in 5 days, actually. So,
Have you determined where you're going to bury the witnesses afterwards?
let's just say that I am somewhere in Grand Staircase Escalante, the most remote region on Earth, or at least in North America, that isn't in the upper Canadian, territories, because you'll freeze to death up there. But yeah.
Also, the permafrost is no good for digging. You're in a better location.
Exactly.
Do you have your stash of illegal blue chews ready for the wedding night?
Illegal blue chew.
Yeah, you don't need regular blue chew. You need the
That's what I'm sending him some from Mexico.
Mexican blue chew.
I'm gonna send him some like a big Costco pack of blue chews.
Next time we see Vaughn, he'll have rictus or something like that.
For the person who mentioned people getting me too, you seem to be very willing to have that happen. Anyway, thank you. I gotta go.
Thank you guys all for participating. Definitely thank you guys for watching the show and all of the comments. The chat was moving at warp speed. And fellas, I guess we are out.